Welcome to Accreditation Conversations. I'm your host, Amy Dykins of Weave, and I'm pleased today to be joined by Dr. Wheelan. Dr. Wheelan, it has been a pleasure to watch you from afar. For many years, I have been able to observe your work with SACSCOC, as well as before that in Virginia. You and your organization have really influenced quality assurance in higher education. And I admire that work tremendously. I do that work every day with other institutions that are accredited by SACSCOC. And so that makes it hard for me to decide, where do I want to start, right? Like there's so many things that we could talk about, right? And so I decided that instead of kind of jumping in there, that I would take a step back and use the opportunity to ask you a little more personal question. So would you share with us a little bit about how you got started in accreditation? What really led you to this role?
Sure, Amy, and thank you for the kind words. I got started when I was a faculty member in psychology, writing that section report for our institution's self-study at that time. This was back in the 1970s, early 80s. And there was a whole different structure to the accreditation report at that particular time. It was still called a self-study, and there were disciplinary sections that had been, specifically identified. And so I started with that. Then I went back to graduate school and went on many visits where we
Oh,
sized up an institution in a day and a half. Which kind of put me in the framework of, why am I doing this? Oh, now I understand why I'm doing it, 40 years later. And then actively as a peer evaluator myself, when I became president in 1992, I started going out on visits and have been involved with it ever since.
that's fabulous. I love the idea of imagining you many, many years ago as a graduate student doing little mini visits. And I'm trying to imagine what kind of questions a graduate student might I think of them as very enthusiastic and, like, oh, I'm going to ask you all the hard questions or things like
It,
that.
it was it was indeed interesting because I had I had been a faculty member in psychology. I didn't know anything about anything outside of my academic discipline, and so it was quite a learning experience for me to learn about all the stuff that student services does, and all the finance stuff and the facilities and everything outside of instruction. So it was more of a learning experience for me in that way than it was in how to evaluate an institution.
Yeah, excellent. I often tell folks that in my role at Weave, I work with lots of really wonderful folks and, accreditation organizations as well as folks leading on campus. And it's all very uh, fulfilling and interesting work around higher education. But I also got my start in the classroom. I was a business faculty. And the one thing that I really miss is being able to interact with students and some of those things, the energy that they bring to the campus, things like that. And so I love hearing, I'm trying to imagine you being a very dynamic, I would imagine, professor in the classroom.
I'll pay you later for all those compliments. I think
Ah,
I think that's one reason I enjoy doing so many public speaking events, because I miss the interaction as well.
yeah, it's nice. We're at a higher level now and it makes a big impact, but having those daily interactions, that's why we got into education. That's what we love about it. So
Exactly.
excellent. Thank you so much for sharing a little bit more personally with us. I'm going to ask you another question that's also a little bit personal for you and I. You over the years have been a very strong voice for women professionals, and I appreciate that. I also had mentors along the way that were very much supportive of the work that I was doing while I'm balancing a career and a family, things like that. And so now that, when I'm not a podcast host in my daily life, I'm the CEO of an ed tech company. And so I try to make sure that I'm aware and trying to pay that forward. And so I would ask you, what kind of advice do you have for me in my role as I try to support other women in being involved?
Well, thank you for being proactive in that, because there are a lot of people, men and women, who don't stop to mentor other folks coming behind them. Part of that started for me because I'm a product of the 60s. I grew up during both a racial revolution and a gender revolution. And being a minority and a woman, I was taught that I could do anything. And it's difficult for me to understand women who don't have that kind of self confidence. And so part of what I suggest to you is be positive. Give that positive feedback when you see examples that you'd like to see emulated or repeated. Be honest when you see somebody headed off in a not so good direction. Pull them aside and say, you might want to rethink how you approach that, or that may not have been the best time for you to express what you're feeling. Some people would say I don't listen to my own advice, but nonetheless, that that is something I try to do. And then provide learning opportunities for folks. There are a lot of times, especially on a campus, where faculty members, female faculty members, never get the opportunity to lead because people see, well, you're a faculty member, you don't want to go anywhere. And unless they tell you that they have that interest, you might not know. But if you see somebody who shows potential and, might want to, at some point in their career, take an alternative path, and by all means, give them the opportunity to learn what that's about. Those are kind of the three things that come to mind when I think of that one.
Nice. Those sound like really solid advice, and I appreciate you're echoing something that somebody else had said along the way. Of sometimes it's just acknowledging it, right? Like it makes you aware, like, oh, I should be looking for places where I can be supportive. Just being aware that this helps folks, and I can look back on my career and think about key folks along the way who, even though maybe I didn't raise my hand and say, I want to do that, I volunteer, or I think I have that skill set, right? Kind of thinking I wasn't that direct on volunteering for it, but they were willing to step forward and say, yeah, I think that this is something you would be good at, or maybe you should get involved.
Yeah, most of my career has not been planned. It has evolved because people have said, I saw this job and I think you do well in that particular position. And I'd say, okay, fine, and go for it. But yeah, unless you have someone who's in your corner like that, then sometimes you miss out on a lot of opportunities, and the organization misses out on a lot of talent because they aren't aware that somebody has that aspiration and they haven't reached back for it.
Yeah, excellent. You're exactly right. We are actually have been talking to some folks recently around not just accreditation leadership, but assessment leadership on campus, and noticing that there are a lot of silver-haired folks in the room, which is wonderful to have that experience. But there's a lot of work still to be done, and making sure that we're bringing in folks that have fresh energy and new perspectives, but to continue the good work that we've made, as much as folks want to beat up higher ed and accreditation, in my opinion, over the last 15 years, I have seen a lot of progress. I really honestly have. And I just, we want to make sure that continues. We don't want to see folks starting to think about, what's next for them, and retiring and those kind of things, and not have anybody that somebody said, hey, get involved kind of thinking. Yeah. So on that note, I think I'll turn us back to accreditation a little bit more. Thank you for indulging me a little bit there. But it's a lot of fun to have the opportunity to sit down with somebody like you. And I think about leading an accreditation organization, especially one like SACSCOC that is always going to be a major player in these conversations. That seems like a really hard job to me.
Some days.
Yeah.
So it's certainly challenging. I remember when I first started this position, after about 3 months here, someone asked me what I liked best about the job. And I said, the fact that no 2 days are alike. And they asked me, what do I like least? I said, the fact that no 2 days are alike. Because you never know what's coming down the pike. And it's very difficult to establish a routine because you don't know what's coming down the pike. So that's the good and the bad of it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So as you think back over your years doing this kind of accreditation work, whether it's at SACSCOC or in other places where you've been involved in accreditation, what are the hardest parts of being involved in accreditation?
I think recognizing quality and helping institutions grow and recognize that just because they do something one way doesn't make it wrong because I don't do it that way. Those are the kinds of challenges that we run into with folks. The other thing is that I go out and visit and I do presentations and people say, thank you, so much for what you do. And I'm going, I don't get a vote in this process. I am not a voting member of the board. All I do is manage the process. And so I will accept that thanks as I've hired the right people to serve as vice presidents to work with your institution, or we've put in the right training for peer evaluators. But otherwise, don't thank me because I didn't do anything as
Yeah,
far as, the accreditation of that institution. Yeah.
Yeah, folks think that you maybe have 2 votes, and turns out you have no votes.
Exactly. Well, they think I have a lot of power, and I don't, in the sense of, this is a peer review process. And so all of the board members that make the decisions and all of the people that evaluate or who evaluate the institutions are their peers. I ceased being a peer when I became president of this organization. When I was still at an institution, then I was their peer. But yeah, I realize I'm the face of the organization, but I don't have any power. I've got a lot of influence, but I don't have any legitimate power.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think especially folks, of course, those of us who are more involved in accreditation on a daily basis understand that it's a peer evaluation process. But I think that there is a lot of confusion about that out there on campus, even, where folks think that, the accreditor is doing something to them or something like that. But peer evaluation is really the hallmark of higher education accreditation. Can you talk about that a little bit more for folks?
Yeah, all of our standards that we have, all of our policies have to be approved by our members. Staff and I don't sit up here and say, okay, how can we shaft the institution today? What can we force them to be able to do? It's what peers think are important in assessing the quality of an institution, and institutions are evaluated based on those standards. So we, as staff, manage the process, but we don't create the standards that go along with it. And that's, when I hear somebody say, oh, that accrediting body is just too powerful. Well, blame the members. It's the members that decide that this is what they want done, not me, and certainly not my staff.
Yeah, and that's not unique to SACSCOC. That is the
No.
case in across accreditation in higher
Yes, it is.
education. Oh.
Yes,
So,
it
and
is.
it's interesting too, in the role that I play, and folks that I work with at institutions. Sometimes they'll ask us questions about their accreditations, about their SACSCOC accreditation, and what do folks expect and things like that. And frequently, we'll kind of redirect them back to their SACSCOC vice presidents. Because that really, from our perspective, is who they should be asking those questions to in those particular cases. But then we'll get this weird pushback sometimes, like they don't want to ask their VP. And I'm always surprised by that.
Well, I think one reason is because they don't want the VP to feel like this is something that I should know that I don't. That's you all pay our salaries, is what I tell institutions all the time. We work for you. So if you have a question, please ask us. I give my personal cell phone number and email to all the presidents and tell them, if you can't find your vice president, give me a call. I don't want you sitting out there uninformed, or frustrated or worried about what's going on. But that's what the vice presidents do. They have a caseload of about 70 institutions. And they understand that it's a juggling act, but they know when we hire them that there is an expectation that if you get a question, you're going to respond right away. Even if I'm on the road, I can't find that till I get back to the office on Thursday, but I'll contact you then. So I would hope that folks would not feel discomfort in calling a VP. There's nothing wrong with it. Email is easier because they are on the road a lot, but they are very good about responding to those inquiries. And nobody bites. That's not in the job description. We don't bite institutional personnel who call with questions, or we don't bite students who call with complaints, or so don't be afraid to call. That's what we're here for.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, it's a wealth of information that folks, I feel like, again, you need to also educate yourself as an institutional leader, right? But when you do have questions, they're the source of truth is kind of what
That's
we
right.
say.
We have also redone our webpage in anticipation of all the questions that we've gotten over the years. There's a frequently asked questions section, so sometimes the answer they're looking for can be found right there. But
Yeah,
if
good.
not, we have email addresses and phone numbers of all the VPs on our website, so give us a holler.
Yeah, excellent. I think the other major player then in this ecosystem is the peer reviewer. And so thinking about, how important they are in this process and this army of volunteers that we rely on. From your perspective, what makes a really great peer reviewer? What's their role?
Well, first of all, we send out in our organization, I can't attest to the other accreditors because I've never worked at any of the others, but we send people from similar institutions out to evaluate an institution. So someone from a Research One institution will have a group of peers from other Research One institutions. We're not going to send somebody from a community college to go evaluate a Research One, nor vice versa, which is what, in our mind, makes it a peer review process. These are folks who understand what that institution is supposed to be doing. They themselves come from institutions with similar missions, perhaps do things in a similar manner, or at least could recognize the effectiveness of what it is that that particular institution is doing. So their role is to evaluate the information that is sent to us for appropriateness and adequacy at that particular institution, given that institution's mission and purpose. It is to make recommendations to the Board of Trustees of SACSCOC as to the status of the accreditation of a particular institution. It is to understand our standards such that they can provide some appropriate feedback and some feedback that has some basis of education and realism to it when they're telling them why they do feel that they may be out of compliance with one of our standards.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. Maybe I can ask you to say a little bit more about that in particular, thinking about a peer reviewer who is interpreting standards and the context that they come from is important because standards aren't necessarily, while they are the standard, they're not necessarily maybe implemented or executed the same.
Exactly. We have challenges sometimes with peer reviewers who will say, "Well, that's not right," and when you dig down into it, it's because they don't do it that way at their institution, so therefore it can't be right. And the good news is all of the committees have consensus decisions. This is not a one person decision, and so you may have one person who's just hell bent, on a decision, but it's the whole committee that has to come in and evaluate it. So that's the good news. You talked earlier about people getting involved as peer reviewers on our offsite committee, which is the first step of review. We make sure that our committees are made up 50% of brand new people who have not been on a committee and 50% of seasoned people, because we are aware, number one, we'll burn out the ones that we call upon all the time if we continue to call upon them and not augment their participation with new people. But then when they do tell us no, who do we have left to participate unless we get those new people involved? And it's a way for people to see what the process is. We offer observer opportunities for institutions that are about to begin their reaffirmation process so that they can see what to expect when a committee's coming to campus, for example, because that can also be stressful. And it gives them a chance to learn the what I call committee think. How is that committee going to interpret the information that was given to you? So we try not to just throw peer reviewers in there and say, okay, sink or swim. That's in addition to training videos and things that we have for peer evaluators.
Nice. And what a great professional development opportunity for somebody to be able to not only experience firsthand what it's like to be going through the accreditation from the other side, perhaps, but also that you have this opportunity to go and learn from your peers at other institutions. You use the example of somebody who was dead set on this is the way you do it. But I mean, if you can open your mind and really see like, oh, like maybe these are practices that would benefit other, institutions that I'm involved in.
Yeah, and I tell peer evaluators all the time, you always learn something that you might take back to your own institution. Everybody doesn't always get to travel. With the pandemic, nobody got to travel. And so to be able to witness, whether through a Zoom meeting or a written report or actually a visit, what other institutions are doing, you kind of go, I hadn't thought about that. Maybe we should consider doing something. So you're right. It is one of the better professional development activities out there, I think.
Yeah, excellent. You also brought up something that not everybody does with their accreditation processes, and that's the off-site review. And so since we have listeners from other both institutional / regional accreditors, but also thinking about programmatic disciplinary folks, can you talk a little bit about that process and how it works into the overall process?
Yeah, probably 20 years ago, right before I came on board, we changed our standards. I mentioned to you that as a faculty member, we had what we call the self-study. An institution would look at the standards, talk about how they comply, turn in the report, and then hold their breath until the board decision was announced 2 years later. Now we have a process where institutions, since this is a continuous improvement process, have an opportunity to provide additional information all along the way. And so the first step is for a what we now call compliance certification to be submitted. And we have a committee that goes through and says, yes, we agree you're in compliance, or nope, we don't agree you're in compliance, and here's why. Or I can't figure out whether you're in compliance or not based on this information. That is sent back to the president of the institution, who has an option of sending back a focused report that provides additional information. Sometimes they just weren't clear. Sometimes they left a chart out. Sometimes, there was just a whole part of the question that wasn't answered because some of our standards are multi-part standards. And then that report, along with the offsite, goes to the committee that's actually going to visit the institution. And part of what they will do is to examine what we call our quality enhancement plan, which is an opportunity for an institution to talk about how it focuses on student learning. What it is they expect students to learn, how they assess whether they've learned it, and then how has the institution changed itself to make sure that future students, are indeed learning. That report, along with those first two, then goes to our board, who makes a decision on the status of the institution. And so there's, information along the way that is gathered that can better position the institution and make it so that we better understand what it is that they do, and they can actually demonstrate that they are meeting those standards.
Yeah, excellent. It sounds like a really nice organizational learning process. Honestly, it's not something where you're giving the institution the final exam. Like that's it,
Right.
One and done.
Exactly.
Kind of things.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's excellent. You're scaffolding a lot of that work along the way, and like as you said, very involved, certainly, but a continuous type of dialogue that you're having with the institution.
Exactly.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Many people also think that that's the only time we touch bases with our institutions as well, and it certainly is not. Institutions that have not demonstrated compliance have follow-up reports, or all of our institutions have a 5th year report, so we can kind of make sure that they're not waiting until year 8 to try to fix some things. It takes longer than 2 years to fix. And so there's constant conversation going on with our institutions.
Yeah, excellent. It's I can remember that question on campus at some point along the way. When is this done?
Yeah. Yeah, it doesn't ever get done. If you're doing it right, it doesn't ever get done.
Yeah, as you said, a continuous improvement process. It's continuous. Right. Excellent.
Yep.
Well, so you are kind of starting to touch on something that, everybody is hoping I will ask you about Florida. But I thought perhaps it would be nice if we took it to a little bit broader level, right? And talk a little bit about, politics and higher education. I would love to hear a little bit from you about this environment and what's happening here today. What is the accreditor's role from your perspective, and how is it being influenced by politics?
Yeah, you're so kind. Florida is not it's not new for states to be involved in issues that historically have been the purview of higher education institutions. They took it further, however, in that they made a decision about accreditation and had no institutional input. They just said, rather than changing their law to say that they would accept any accreditor that an institution decided it wanted to join, they just said, you have to go find another accreditor. And that's what is different. This came about because during the Trump administration, the rules were changed so that an institution could change accreditors. Historically, institutional accreditors had been determined by geographic regions, and you were kind of stuck with the region that you have. And some of the folks who were involved in negotiated rulemaking during that time decided that since national and regional accreditors both were institutional accreditors, then that's what we would call them. And we would get rid of the distinctions between national and regional. And so an institution could choose its accreditor. In Florida, the state told them they have to change accreditors. And that's what was new in Florida. The Department of Education has said, whoa, that was not the intent for you to force institutions to change. It was to allow them to change if there were reasons to do so. And a reason is not because you disagree with the accreditor and the accreditation standards. When you join them, that's what you say you're going to do. So it's still in limbo at this particular moment. Institutions in Florida are having to choose another accreditor. I believe that their Board of Visitors has determined which accreditor or to which they may apply. I don't know. No, they've not shared with us that information. But I told our Florida members that they are our members until they are no longer our members. And we will continue to hold them accountable for the standards. We will continue to involve them in all of our processes. And for me, nothing has changed.
I can't imagine being on a campus where now I'm trying to maintain my accreditation while simultaneously beginning a brand new one. We just spoke about how this is a continuous dialogue that takes years because it's complex and it's scaffolded in so many ways. What are they doing? I cannot imagine.
There is no logic in politics.
Yeah, that's unfortunate.
It's political, and they are struggling with it. Yeah.
Interesting. It seems we've also heard some grumblings in other areas, not just thinking about accreditation, but some thinking about academic freedom, for example, and
academic freedom is one, post-tenure review is one, curricular decisions. That's what I'm saying. All of those kinds of things historically have been the purview of the institutions. And when you talk about the triad being, the federal, the state, and the accreditor representing the institutions, then suddenly the lines are blurred. And I think all of us as accreditors are struggling with how do we respond to this because, the states pay the money. And the golden rule says he who has the gold makes the rule. And so you've put the institutions, in a bind when you say, in essence, choose. Are you going to follow the state or are you going to follow the accreditor?
Yeah.
So it's murky right about now. It's a good word.
It is murky. That's a good way to put it. But it also is incredibly important that we be paying attention, it seems, because accreditation and the negotiations that took place in order for accreditation to become that kind of the golden key in many ways to federal dollars was important. We talked about peer reviewers being the peers making the standards, peers that understand this work and understand the importance of certain best practices and expectations. Not wanting to, turn this into something that is more political than we intended either. It seems incredibly important for us to speak up and be a part of the conversation and not kind of like watch it happen from the sidelines.
Yeah, it'd be nice if somebody spoke up beside me.
Yeah, exactly.
Feel like I have a bullseye on my back.
Oh, yeah.
Uh-huh.
Well,
It's okay.
I was going to say you're one lady that we trust to speak up for us,
Well,
so we
thank you.
appreciate that, and we'll
Thank
continue
you.
these conversations. That's what I mean. Honestly, part of the podcast and the podcast conversations are about being able to elevate. Accreditation away from so much negativity, right? It has not
Yeah.
been my experience. I say that to folks frequently. It has not been my experience. Accreditation is hard frequently, and it does take resources, but it is just like you would do in business. I come from a business background, quality assurance and continuous
Exactly.
improvement, and it's an investment in the future of higher
Yep.
education. And that's been my experience rather than something that's rubber stamp or, some of the other, we hear these crazy conversations about accreditation limits innovation.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that it's interesting because all innovation I think that has happened in higher ed, it could not have happened had the accreditors not approved it. So it's not that we're anti innovation. Sometimes our institutions have these grandiose ideas, and as accreditors, they have not demonstrated that they have the capacity to pull off these good ideas. And so that's when we become the bad guy and say, you don't have the facilities, you don't have the budget, you don't have the personnel. I'm not sure you're going to be able to
Yeah,
do
which
this.
is good for business too, right? You're not saying don't ever do it. You're just saying
Exactly.
this isn't ready,
That's
perhaps.
right. That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Excellent. So let's shift gears just a little bit and talk to an audience that is also listening to the accreditation conversations, and that is accreditors, especially thinking about programmatic accreditors. So lots of disciplinary programmatic accreditors who are also thinking about this work from the disciplines and how their quality assurance processes happen for students. And if I was trying to think about if I was listening, if I was that person, I would love to have the opportunity to hear from you. What advice would you give them as they lead their accreditation organizations?
Have someone on whom you can vent outside of the organization is the first thing that you need. Be sure you hire people who are talented, who are energetic, and who have some campus experience or some programmatic experience so that they understand what it is the institution is trying to say that it does, even when sometimes it falters with the correct words. I think also when you do hire those staff, leave them alone to do their job, but be there to support them as they need that particular support. As president of an accrediting body, I perceive myself as the cheerleader for the institutions. If I were a programmatic accreditor, I would be a cheerleader for the programs and to make sure that there's some consistency across the evaluation of all of those programs so that when you go to a particular legislative body, whether it's state or local, state or federal, then you can sing from the same song sheet no matter where you're speaking. Those I think are primary to having a good, well-functioning accrediting organization.
Nice. So much of it goes back to having good people, like you said.
It
Yeah.
does. It does.
Excellent. So I would like to ask what it is that you might be reading right now or listening to, perhaps, that you would recommend to folks.
Well, on the personal side, I tend to read romance novels to just
You got to
escape
relax.
reading. Yeah, that's right. Just to unwind and kind of let it all go and not even think about it. On the professional side, the last thing I read was the top strategic issues for boards that AGB had put out. One of the reasons for that is because we have some boards that are challenged. And so I do a presentation to boards
Oh, nice.
during their retreats or when there's a new president coming on board and they want to talk about president board relations and things like that. And so to hear what AGB, since their whole focus is governing boards, thinks are the strategic issues. That was one of the documents that I just finished. And then I just ordered a copy of George Pruitt. He was the chair of Middle States Board for a while, and I've known Dr. Pruitt forever. He's just written a book called From Protest to President.
Yeah, I saw that.
And so, yeah, he's one of my peers in age and longevity, and so it'd be interesting to see, how our paths have been similar and or different.
Maybe you.
Other than that, it's just whatever comes across the desk is, what I'm reading. I don't have time to just focus in on one thing.
Yeah, that sounds wonderful. Maybe Dr. Pruitt will inspire you to write your story.
Oh, sure. Well, he's retired and he waited until then to do it.
That's
so
true. I was going to say
it'll be a minute before I get to it.
You start taking take some notes.
I can do that.
There you go.
I can do that.
So I am very much looking forward to coming to Atlanta soon to see you at the conference, and everybody's going to be back in person.
Yeah, we're looking forward to it. We have almost 4,000 people registered.
Oh my goodness.
So,
wow.
Yeah, so people are ready to travel, and that's good.
It is good. And it's going to be energizing, I think, for a lot of folks to be able to be back together and talk about all this. So if somebody else wanted to continue the conversation with you, what would be the best way for them to get in touch?
Well, there are two ways. We have a mailbox that's called questions@sacscoc.org, which you can get through our website, or I have a public email address. It's bwhelan@sacscoc.org. You can drop an inquiry there, and I'll get back to you as I can.
Excellent. Thank you.
But always contact your vice president if you're one of our members.
There you go. There you go.
Yeah, because they'll be more familiar with your institution than I. Yeah, I've got those 50,000-foot answers where they have the specifics of an institution.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today.
It's my pleasure.
Yeah, it's been a lot of fun.